Hello, friends and insiders. This is Government Unfiltered. I'm Dan Williams. This episode focuses on Turkey's October incursion into Syria and the withdrawal of U.S. troops that was reported on in the media. My frustration was over most media reports for focusing solely on the impact of U.S. support for forces in Syria who had helped to fight the Islamic State. I knew there had to be more to the situation, and as you'll learn in this episode, the tensions between U.S. and Turkey have been building in recent years. There are also significant U.S. military assets in Turkey that could be impacted by the ongoing tensions. This episode is based off a briefing from the Congressional Research Service that provides information to our representatives in the House and Senate. By the end of this episode, you'll have a much better understanding of the situation than I think you'll find through a traditional media outlet. Turkey's October 2019 incursion into Syria, background, and U.S. relations. This podcast provides information and analysis on 5 points with regard to Turkey. 1. Turkey's strategic orientation toward the United States and Russia, and how that affects Turkish cooperation with the United States and NATO. 2. Turkey's October 2019 incursion into Syria, including the effect on Syrian Kurds, who have helped the United States counter the Islamic State. 3. Trump administration sanctions and their reversal, possible sanctions from Congress, and other options after Turkey's October incursion into Syria. 4. Issues surrounding Turkey's purchase of a Russian S-400 surface-to-air defense system, its removal from the F-35 aircraft program, and possible sanctions under existing legislation. And 5. Domestic Turkish developments, including politics under President Erdogan's largely authoritarian and polarizing rule, and some economic concerns. There are also some important acronyms to know. I'll try and post reminders during the reading because they don't line up well with the actual names they relate to. I'll also have the acronyms in the episode notes. Turkey's strategic orientation. Overview. Numerous points of tension have raised questions within the United States and Turkey about the two countries' alliance, as well as Turkey's commitment to NATO and a Western orientation. For their part, Turkish leaders may bristle because they feel like Turkey is treated as a junior partner, and they arguably have sought greater foreign policy diversification through stronger relationships with more countries. A number of complicated dynamics drive Turkey's international relationships. Turkey's history as both a regional power and an object of great power aggression translates into wide popularity for nationalistic political actions and discourse. Moreover, Turkey's cooperative relationships with countries whose respective interests may conflict involve a balancing act. Threats from Syria and Iraq, and the regional roles of the United States, Russia, and Iran further complicate Turkey's situation. Also, lacking significant rents from natural resources, Turkey's economic performance is largely dependent on maintaining diversified global trade and investment ties, including with the West. Concerns among Turkish leaders that U.S. policy might hinder Turkey's security date back at least to the 1991 Gulf War, but the following developments have fueled them since 2010. Close U.S. military cooperation against the Islamic State with Syrian Kurdish forces linked to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, also known as the PKK, a U.S.-designated terrorist organization that has waged an on-and-off insurgency against the Turkish government since the 1980s, while using refugees in both Syria and Iraq. Turkey's view that the United States supported or acquiesced to events during post-2011 turmoil in Egypt and Syria that undermined Sunni Islamist figures tied to Turkey. Many Western leaders' criticism of President Erdogan for ruling in an increasingly authoritarian manner. Erdogan's sensitivity to Western concerns was exacerbated by a 2016 coup attempt that Erdogan blames on Fethullah Gulen, a former Turkish imam who leads a worldwide socio-religious movement and lives in the United States. Turkey has thus arguably sought a more independent course than at any time since joining NATO in 1952. Despite having a long history of discord with Russia, including some ongoing disagreements about Syria and Libya, Turkey may be disposed to cooperate more with Russia in hopes of reducing threats that Turkey faces, influencing regional political outcomes, and decreasing Turkey's military and economic reliance on the West. After reaching a low point in Turkey-Russia relations in 2015 to 2016, brought about by the Turkish downing of a Russian plane near the Turkey-Syria border, and Russia's temporary imposition of sanctions, Erdogan and Russian President Vladimir Putin have cultivated closer ties. Putin showed support for Erdogan during the 2016 coup attempt, and subsequently allowed Turkey to carry out military operations in northern Syria over the next 2 years that helped roll back Kurdish territorial control and reduce refugee flows near Turkey's border. Effect of tensions on U.S.-NATO cooperation. Turkey's location near several global hotspots has made the continuing availability of its territory for the stationing and transport of arms, cargo, and personnel valuable for the United States and NATO. From Turkey's perspective, NATO's traditional value has been to mitigate its concerns about encroachment by neighbors. Turkey initially turned to the West largely as a reaction to aggressive post-World War II posturing by the Soviet Union. In addition to Incirlik Air Base near the southern Turkish city of Adana, other key U.S. NATO sites include an early warning missile defense radar in eastern Turkey and a NATO ground forces command in Izmir. Turkey also controls access to and from the Black Sea through its straits, pursuant to the Montreux Convention of 1936. Current U.S.-Turkey tensions have fueled discussion from the U.S. perspective about the advisability of continued U.S.-NATO use of Turkish bases. As a result of the tensions, and questions about the safety and utility of Turkish territory for U.S. and NATO assets, some observers have advocated exploring alternative basing arrangements in the region. The Trump administration reportedly reduced the U.S. military presence at Incirlik in 2018, while contemplating broader reductions in Turkey. While an August 2018 report cited a Department of Defense spokesperson as saying that the United States was not leaving Incirlik, some reports suggest that expanded or potentially expanded U.S. military presences in Greece and Jordan might be connected with concerns about Turkey. There are historical precedents for such changes. On a number of occasions, the United States has withdrawn military assets from Turkey, or Turkey has restricted U.S. use of its territory or airspace. Most prominently, Turkey closed most U.S. defense and intelligence installations in Turkey during the 1975 to 1978 U.S. arms embargo that Congress imposed in response to Turkey's military intervention in Cyprus. Assessing costs and benefits to the United States of a U.S. NATO presence in Turkey, and of potential changes in U.S. NATO posture, largely revolves around two questions. 1. How important is U.S. NATO support to Turkey's external defense and internal stability, and to what extent does that support serve U.S. interests? 2. To what extent does the United States rely on direct use of Turkish territory or airspace to secure and protect U.S. interests? Syria and the October 2019 incursion. The overall conflict in Syria presents both challenges and opportunities for Turkey. Turkish-led forces have occupied and administered some parts of northern Syria since 2016. Turkey's chief objective has been to thwart the PKK-linked Syrian Kurdish People's Protection Units, also known as the YPG, from establishing an independent area along Syria's northern border with Turkey. Turkish-led military operations to that end have included Operation Euphrates Shield, August 2016 to March 2017, against an Islamic State-controlled area in northern Syria, and Operation Olive Branch in early 2018 directly against the Kurdish enclave of Afrin. Turkey has considered the YPG and its political counterpart, the Democratic Union Party, known as the PYD, to be the top threat to Turkish security because of Turkish concerns that YPG-PYD gains have emboldened the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, in Turkey. Shortly after the YPG-PYD, again that's the Syrian Kurdish People's Protection Units and Democratic Union Party, began achieving military and political success with its leading role in what became the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, an umbrella group including Arabs and other non-Kurdish elements that became the main U.S. ground force partner against the Islamic State in 2015. Turkey-PKK peace talks broke down, tensions increased, and occasional violence resumed within Turkey. In October 2019, Turkey's military attacked some Syrian Democratic Forces-controlled areas in northeastern Syria after President Trump ordered a pullback of U.S. Special Forces following a call with President Erdogan. In the previous months, joint U.S.-Turkey ground patrols had monitored the border area, and some YPG fortifications were dismantled. But Turkish leaders repeatedly criticized the United States for not doing enough to secure the removal of the YPG from the border area. The declared aims of what Turkey called Operation Peace Spring were to target terrorists, both the YPG and the Islamic State, and create a safe zone for the possible return of some of the approximately 3.6 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. The ground component of the Turkish operation, as during previous Turkish operations in Syria, was carried out to a major extent by militia forces, comprised largely of Sunni Arab opponents of the Syrian government. Let's talk briefly about the Syrian refugees in Turkey. In addition to its ongoing military activities in Syria, Turkey hosts about 3.6 million registered Syrian refugees, more than any other country. President Erdogan has claimed that Turkey has spent $40 billion on refugee assistance, though one source estimates that the amount could be closer to $24 billion. According to official estimates, the Syrian refugee population in Turkey increased in 2018, even though about 291,000 refugees returned to Syria. Turkey has managed the refugees' presence in Turkish society by addressing their legal status, basic needs, employment, education, and impact on local communities. However, according to one human rights advocacy group, Turkey has gradually limited operational space for international NGOs in Gaziantep and other Turkish cities that have been serving as hubs for aid delivery, with less experienced local NGOs attempting to fill the resulting gap. Turkey has closed several refugee camps in 2019 and encouraged Syrians in those camps to integrate into Turkish society while resolution of their long-term status is pending. Problems in the Turkish economy over the past year may be fueling some tensions between refugees and Turkish citizens. Reports that, in light of domestic pressure, Turkey may already have forcibly returned thousands of Syrian refugees to other areas in Syria, though Turkish officials deny these claims. In response to international criticism of Operation Peace Spring, Erdogan warned that he could allow refugees to leave Turkey for Europe, notwithstanding an existing Turkey-European Union agreement. And now let's get back to the 2019 incursion. On October 17, Vice President Pence negotiated a conditional pause to Operation Peace Spring with Turkey that President Trump said on October 23 had become a permanent ceasefire. Pursuant to a joint U.S.-Turkey statement from October 17, the YPG, Syrian Kurdish People's Protection Units, had generally withdrawn from a key area inside the Syrian border, a largely Arab-populated section between the Syrian towns of Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain. This ceded control to Turkish-led forces whose forward progress had effectively cut off YPG communications between the largely Kurdish-populated enclaves of Kobani and Qamishli. Reports indicate that since Operation Peace Spring began, civilians on both sides of the border have been killed, with some areas in Turkey hit by cross-border fire, and that more than 215,000 people on the Syrian side had been displaced, with about 106,000 subsequently returning to their areas of origin. International organizations have publicized evidence of possible violations of international human rights law by Turkish-led forces. In the October 17 U.S.-Turkey statement, Turkey committed to protect Kurdish and other residents living in the safe zone, though verifying compliance is made more difficult by a lack of clear geographic parameters to define the zone. On October 22, Turkey and Russia agreed to a memorandum of understanding that 1. Solidified Turkish claims of control over the areas occupied during Operation Peace Spring and via the joint U.S.-Turkey statement. 2. Provided for the further withdrawal of YPG forces from zones 30 kilometers deep in the remaining Turkey-Syria border areas east of the Euphrates River. And 3. Provided for Russian and Syrian government control over these zones, with joint Turkey-Russia patrols to monitor the area extending 10 kilometers south of the border. Russia asserted on October 29 that YPG forces had withdrawn pursuant to the Memorandum of Understanding. One U.S.-based analyst explained Turkey's deal with Russia by saying that the U.S. was offering more or less the same deal, with accommodation to the SDF. Syrian Democratic Forces. Russia's deal offered accommodation with the Syrian regime, and Turkey chose that because their priority was to break the SDF structure. Ultimate Turkish and YPG objectives regarding the areas in question remain unclear. After October 29, Turkish-led fighters have periodically skirmished against YPG or Syrian government forces in places outside the area under nominal Turkish control. U.S. officials apparently intend to continue partnering with SDF forces in some areas of Syria south of the zones from which YPG personnel were cleared, while the SDF has made some arrangements for its protections by Syrian government forces. According to one media account, Kurdish-led forces may have left car bombs and landmines before vacating areas now controlled by Turkish-led forces, and some of those explosives have reportedly caused civilian casualties. It also remains unclear how the Turkish-led administration of areas occupied during Operation Peace Spring might resemble Turkish-led administration in areas of northern Syria west of the Euphrates, including on the question of refugee return. Reportedly, some 300,000 to 400,000 of the 3.6 million Syrian refugees in Turkey hail from northeastern Syria. U.S. sanctions and other actions since October. Administration sanctions. The Trump administration imposed sanctions on some Turkish cabinet ministries and ministers in response to Operation Peace Spring, but has since lifted them. These sanctions may have been intended partly to appease members of Congress calling for stronger sanctions because of Operation Peace Spring's negative impact on America's Syrian Kurdish partners and other Syrian civilians, and partly to encourage diplomacy to end hostilities. The sanctions came pursuant to Executive Order 13984, which President Trump signed on October 14 and which remains in effect. According to the President, Executive Order 13984 authorizes, quote, a broad range of consequences, including financial sanctions, the blocking of property, and barring entry into the United States, unquote. Possible congressional sanctions and other actions. Congress has taken some action in response to Turkey's October incursion into Syria. On October 16, the House passed House Joint Resolution 77, criticizing both the Trump administration's decision to pull troops back from the Turkey-Syria border area and Turkey's military operations. Then, on October 29, the House passed the Protect Against Conflict by Turkey Act, House Resolution 4695, by a vote of 403 to 16. Among other things, House Resolution 4695 would do the following. Require the President to block the U.S. property, interests in property, and related transactions of and or deny entry into the United States to 1. Specified Turkish government and military officials and other officials deemed responsible for certain aspects of the Turkish invasion. 2. Foreign persons deemed to have knowingly provided defense articles, services, or technology to Turkey usable by its military in northern Syria. And 3. Halkbank, a major Turkish bank that is majority owned by the government, plus any foreign financial institutions deemed to have, quote, knowingly facilitated significant transactions for the Turkish armed forces or defense industry relating to Turkey's military invasion of northern Syria on October 9, 2019, unquote. Under specified conditions, the administration could waive some of these sanctions for national security reasons. The resolution would also prohibit the transfer of U.S. defense articles, services, and technology to Turkey that are usable by its military in northern Syria. It would require the President to impose sanctions on Turkey for its acquisition of a Russian S-400 air defense system. Also, it would require the administration to report the estimated net worth and sources of income of President Erdogan and his family members. Lastly, it would require the administration to provide plans or reports relating to Turkey's invasion, including possible violations of international law and harm to civilians. Let's briefly discuss Halkbank and a U.S. indictment related to Iran sanctions. On October 15, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York announced a 6-count indictment against Halkbank for, quote, fraud, money laundering, and sanctions offenses related to the bank's participation in a multi-billion-dollar scheme to evade U.S. sanctions on Iran, unquote. In explaining the indictment, the U.S. Attorney stated, quote, The bank's audacious conduct was supported and protected by high-ranking Turkish government officials, some of whom received millions of dollars in bribes to promote and protect the scheme," unquote. The U.S. Attorney also said that the indictment was based on information that emerged from the 2017 to 2018 trial of Halkbank's Deputy General Manager, Mehmet Hakan Atilla. The key witness in this trial was Reza Zarrab, a gold trader, dual Turkish-Iranian citizen, and indicted co-conspirator who entered into a plea bargain in exchange for his cooperation with prosecutors. Zarrab testified that then Prime Minister Erdogan had approved the scheme by which Zarrab and others used Turkish banks to finance the purchase of Iranian oil with gold in violation of U.S. sanctions. President Erdogan regularly criticized the proceedings in the Attila Zarrab case. For the case, U.S. investigators used findings from the 2013 documents previously possessed by Turkish prosecutors, whom Erdogan accused of seeking to undermine his government in condition with the Gulen movement. Attila was convicted in January 2018, sentenced to 32 months in prison, released early in July 2019, and returned to Turkey. Back to the topic of possible congressional sanctions. On October 29, the House, by a vote of 405 to 11, with 3 voting present, passed House Resolution 296, a non-binding resolution characterizing as genocide, quote, "the killing of 1.5 million Armenians by the Ottoman Empire, Turkey's predecessor state, from 1915 to 1923, unquote. The first time in 35 years that a House of Congress has voted to characterize the events in question as genocide. Turkish officials roundly criticized the House's action. Prospects in the Senate for House Resolution 4695 or other sanctions against Turkey are unclear. On October 31, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said the following on the Senate floor, quote, "We should think carefully about what specific effect we want sanctions to have, how Turkey will respond to them, and how Russia or others may exploit growing tensions between Washington and Ankara. Before targeting an economy that is highly integrated with Europe's economy, we should seek a better understanding of the specific economic impact that broad sanctions will have on the global economy. Before using these kinds of policy tools, the kinds we use against Iran and North Korea, against a democracy of 80 million people, we should consider the political impact that blunt sanctions will have on the Turkish people. Will sanctions rally them to our cause or to Erdogan's? Would more targeted sanctions perhaps avoid some of these unintended consequences? These are just some of the critical questions I hope our committees of jurisdiction and the administration are able to examine before we act." Unquote. Some senators have introduced bills to impose sanctions on Turkey and or require the administration to report on specific Turkish actions and aspects of U.S.-NATO relations with Turkey. On November 6, Senators Bob Menendez and Chris Murphy introduced Senate Resolution 409, a resolution entitled to expedited consideration in the Senate that could require a State Department report within 30 days on possible Turkish human rights abuses in Syria and other matters, and lead to additional expedited action on U.S. arms sales and assistance to Turkey. It is unclear whether President Trump would sign sanctions legislation on Turkey, or whether such legislation could attract veto-proof support in both houses of Congress. Regarding other possible congressional action affecting Turkey, a provision in the fiscal year 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, if enacted, could, under certain conditions, lift a 32-year-old arms embargo on U.S. arms sales to the Republic of Cyprus. Effect of sanctions on Turkish behavior. The potential effect of sanctions on Turkish behavior remains unclear. One media article stated that U.S. sanctions are unlikely to deter Turkish military operations because the operations involve, quote, one of Erdogan's core convictions, unquote, that the YPG, Syrian Kurdish People's Protection Units, is equivalent to the Kurdistan Workers' Party. Some sources have asserted that sanctions could negatively affect market confidence and commerce in Turkey, but others suggest that the economic contraction in Turkey that followed its currency shock of 2018 could cushion the impact of sanctions. One financial strategist said that measures constraining Turkish banks from transacting in dollars could particularly affect Turkey's financial system. At various points in Turkey's history, economic crises have contributed to political instability. Sanctions' effect on Turkish public sentiment may be difficult to gauge. While negative effects on Turkey's economy could lead to domestic pressure to change Turkish policies, they could also increase popular support for the government. Some sources suggest that Turkish citizens broadly support action in Syria to counter the YPG and to increase the likelihood of Syrian refugees returning home. Provisions in the pending bills requiring the imposition of sanctions against Turkey in connection with domestically popular policies could potentially boost support for President Erdogan, given substantial existing anti-U.S. sentiment. While Turkey has long-standing, deeply rooted ties with the West, some sanctions could potentially create incentives for Turkey to increase trade, investment, and arms dealings with non-Western actors. Many pending sanctions bills, including House Resolution 4695, would link sanctions against Turkey on Syria with Turkey's acquisition of a Russian S-400 air defense system, by requiring the president to impose sanctions on Turkey for that transaction under Title II of the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, or CAATSA. Members of Congress might consider how such language could influence Turkish actions both on Syria and the S-400 issue, and how Congress might otherwise apply carrots and sticks to affect Turkish behavior on both issues. Other possible U.S. options and NATO implications. U.S. policymakers and lawmakers also could consider other options aimed at influencing Turkish behavior or securing U.S. interests. The United States and other NATO allies have no direct way to remove Turkey from NATO. The only explicit mechanism for leaving NATO in the North Atlantic Treaty is Article 13, which allows parties to leave 1 year after giving a notice of denunciation to the United States. However, the United States and other NATO members could change their contributions of personnel and equipment, and their participation in specific activities or locations in ways that affect cooperation with Turkey. Since 2013, NATO allies have been providing Turkey with air defense support around its border with Syria. On October 14, all 28 member states of the European Union, 22 of whom are also NATO members, agreed to, quote, commit to strong national positions regarding their arms export policy to Turkey, unquote. Several EU member states, including Italy, Europe's top arms exporter to Turkey, France, and Germany, have suspended arms exports to Turkey. But the EU did not want to implement a formal EU-wide arms embargo. Several open-source media outlets have speculated about whether U.S. tactical nuclear weapons may be based at Incirlik Air Base, and if so, whether U.S. officials might consider taking them out of Turkey. On October 16, President Trump expressed confidence in the safety of U.S. military assets that may be based in Incirlik, because it is, quote, a large, powerful airbase, unquote. Turkey's S-400 acquisition from Russia. U.S.-Turkey tensions over Turkey's acquisition of a Russian S-400 air defense system and the resulting U.S. removal of Turkey from the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program, along with possible sanctions on Turkey, could have broad implications for bilateral relations and defense cooperation. It also could affect Turkey's role in NATO. In July 2019, Turkey reportedly began taking delivery of Russian S-400 components. President Erdogan said then that the system would be fully deployed by April 2020. In November, the head of Turkey's Defense Procurement Agency said that the delivery of some components may be delayed beyond the planned timeline over talks on technology sharing and joint production. Removal from the F-35 aircraft program. In response to the beginning of the S-400 deliveries to Turkey, the Trump administration announced on July 17 that it was removing Turkey from participation in the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program. Turkey had planned to purchase 100 U.S. origin F-35s and was one of 8 original consortium partners in the development and industrial production of the aircraft. If Turkey does not receive the F-35, it might turn to other sources, possibly including Russia, to fill its capability need for next-generation aircraft and other major defense purchases. In explaining the U.S. decision to remove Turkey from the F-35 program, Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment Ellen Lord said, quote, Turkey cannot field a Russian intelligence collection platform within the S-400 system in proximity to where the F-35 program makes, repairs, and houses the F-35. Much of the F-35's strength lies in its stealth capabilities, so the ability to detect those capabilities would jeopardize the long-term security of the F-35 program, unquote. A security concern regarding the F-35 could compromise its global marketability and effectiveness. While some Russian radars in Syria may have already monitored Israeli-operated F-35s, intermittent passes at long ranges reportedly might not yield data on the aircraft as conclusive as the more voluminous data available if an S-400 in Turkey could routinely monitor F-35s. However, one U.S.-based analyst has said that U.S. concerns are quote-unquote overblown, and that Russian tracking of F-35s in Turkey would not significantly differ from monitoring elsewhere. How would the end of Turkish involvement impact the F-35 program? Because the F-35 program features multinational industrial inputs, unwinding Turkey's involvement could present financial and logistical challenges. Turkish companies have been involved in about 6 to 7% of the supply chain, building displays, wiring, fuselage structures, and other parts for F-35s provided to all countries. With some lead time to anticipate Turkey's possible removal from the program, the F-35 Joint Program Office within the Department of Defense has identified alternative suppliers for the Turkish subsystems. According to Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment Ellen Lord, existing contracts with Turkish suppliers for over 900 parts would reportedly wind down by March 2020, and the United States, quote, is spending between $500 million and $600 million in non-recurring engineering in order to shift the supply chain, unquote. According to an April 2019 statement from the Joint Programs Office's director, Vice Admiral Matthias Winter, quote, the evaluation of Turkey stopping would be between a 50 and 75 airplane impact over a 2-year period, unquote. It is unclear whether the United States or the F-35 consortium could be liable for financial penalties beyond refunding Turkey's initial investment in the program, an estimated $1.5 billion. Additionally, the depot to service engines for European countries' F-35s was initially slated to be in Turkey. However, according to Undersecretary Lord, quote, there are 2 other European MRO&Us, which stands for Maintenance, Repair, Overhaul, and Upgrade Facilities, that can absorb the volume with no issue whatsoever, unquote. The CEO of Lockheed Martin, the primary contractor for the F-35, said in May 2019 that if Turkey did not purchase the 100 aircraft, the consortium would not have difficulty finding willing buyers for them. 2 possible buyers include Japan and Poland. Sanctions under the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, or CAATSA. The Turkey-Russia S-400 transaction could trigger the imposition of U.S. sanctions under CAATSA. In late July 2019, President Trump reportedly asked a group of senators for flexibility on sanctions implementation regarding Turkey, as he considered pursuing a deal potentially allowing Turkey to remain in the F-35 program if it, 1. agreed not to use the S-400, and 2. acquired a U.S. Patriot air defense system. In early November, President Erdogan said, quote, we bought the S-400. That job is done. But if the U.S. will give us the Patriots, then we can buy them as long as the conditions are suitable, unquote. However, some analysts and former U.S. officials have said that Turkey's S-400 acquisition may not be final, or that a verifiable arrangement that prevents S-400 data gathering on the F-35 could allow the 2 systems to coexist in Turkey. According to one media report, in July Erdogan threatened to retaliate against any sanctions under CAATSA, including by withdrawing Turkey from NATO and ejecting the United States from Incirlik Air Base. Turkey's rationale and implications for NATO. A number of analysts have sought to explain possible political motivation for Turkey's actions on the S-400 deal by citing Turkey's willingness to act more independently in the context of U.S.-Turkey tensions and other regional trends. Some have raised the possibility that Turkey may seek to defend against U.S.-origin aircraft of the type used by elements within the Turkish military during the 2016 coup attempt. Other contributing factors to the S-400 decision may include nationalistic strains within Turkish domestic politics, as well as Turkey's desires for more diversified sources of arms procurement, due partly to its experience from the 1970s U.S. arms embargo over Cyprus. For some observers, the S-400 issue raises the possibility that Russia could take advantage of the U.S.-Turkey friction to undermine the NATO alliance. In 2013, Turkey reached a preliminary agreement to purchase a Chinese air defense system, but withdrew from the deal in 2015, perhaps partly due to concerns voiced within NATO, as well as China's reported reluctance to share technology. Relevant U.S. legislation. A report was due from the Department of Defense on November 1, 2019, to update a November 2018 report on a number of issues affecting U.S.-Turkey defense cooperation, including the S-400 and F-35. Pursuant to the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2019, the update is to include a, quote, detailed description of plans for the imposition of sanctions, if appropriate, unquote, for an S-400 purchase. In June 2019, the House passed House Resolution 372, a non-binding resolution calling for consequences if Turkey does not cancel the S-400 deal. In 2019, 5 separate provisions have either passed a House of Congress or been reported by a committee that would each prevent the use of funds to transfer F-35s to Turkey. Most of the provisions are subject to waiver if the executive branch can certify in some manner that Turkey does not plan to take delivery of or keep the S-400. Domestic Turkish developments. Political developments under Erdogan's rule. President Erdogan has ruled Turkey since becoming prime minister in 2003. After Erdogan became president in August 2014 via Turkey's first ever popular presidential election, he claimed a mandate for increasing his power and pursuing a presidential system of governance, which he achieved in a 2017 referendum and 2018 presidential and parliamentary elections. Some allegations of voter fraud and manipulation surfaced in both elections. Erdogan is a polarizing figure, with about half the country supporting his rule and half the country against it. U.S. and European Union officials have expressed a number of concerns about rule of law and civil liberties in Turkey, including the government's influence on media and Turkey's reported status as the country with the most journalists in prison. Erdogan's consolidation of power has continued amid domestic and international concerns about growing authoritarianism in Turkey. He outlasted the July 2016 coup attempt, after which Turkey's government detained tens of thousands and took over or closed various businesses, schools, and media outlets. As part of the post-coup crackdown, the government has detained some Turks employed at U.S. diplomatic facilities in Turkey. Erdogan's Islamist-leaning Justice and Development Party maintained the largest share of votes in 2019 local elections, but lost some key municipalities to opposition candidates, including Istanbul. It remains unclear to what extent, if at all, these losses pose a threat to Erdogan's rule. Economic status. The Turkish economy slowed considerably during 2018, entering a recession in the second half of the year with negative consequences both for consumer demand and for companies seeking or repaying loans in global markets. During 2018, the Turkish lira depreciated close to 30% against the dollar, in an environment featuring a globally stronger dollar, rule of law concerns and political uncertainty, and significant corporate debt. According to a September 2019 International Monetary Fund analysis of the Turkish economy, quote, growth has rebounded, aided by policy stimulus and favorable market conditions. Following the sharp lira depreciation and associated recession in late 2018, the current calm appears fragile. Reserves remain low, and private sector foreign exchange debt and external financing needs high. Thank you for tuning in. This is the type of show I was considering regularly putting out when I started Government Unfiltered. Then the impeachment inquiry started, and so I shifted my focus. If you enjoy episodes like this, please consider supporting the show at governmentunfiltered.com or insiderfriends.com. The Insider Friends address will take you to my Patreon page. You can go to it directly at patreon.com/TimberlaneMedia. Coming up next, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence just released the Trump-Ukraine impeachment inquiry report, and I'll be looking to read the executive summary for next week's episode. Something else I'm considering getting into is coming out next week, the upcoming DOJ Inspector General's FISA report. It's one that President Trump is saying will reveal, quote, the biggest political scandal in the history of our country, unquote. Other reports are downplaying the significance. Likely, it's possible it's somewhere in between, but at the very least, I'm planning to do the executive summary in a future episode. This show does operate on the value for value model by creating the show and making it available, and from there you can decide what it's worth. If it's worth a cup of coffee, a ticket to the movies, or maybe a nice dinner, whatever you decide, you can return that value and be recognized in an upcoming show by supporting the show at the places I mentioned before, or you can go to glow.fm/insider to donate anonymously on either a one-time or recurring basis. You can also support the show in other ways by rating or reviewing the podcast, following on Twitter @GovUnfiltered, or on Facebook at facebook.com/governmentunfiltered. Thank you for listening.